Hey everyone, this is Chapter 6, Parties and Politics in the West Indies of C.L.R. James, A Political Biography by Kent Worcester. This is the first chapter in Part 3 of the book, and Part 3 starts with a quote from C.L.R. James. Quote, "Only after I had chosen my themes did I recognize that I had completed a circle. I discovered that I had not arbitrarily or by accident worshipped at the shrine of John Bunyan and Aunt Judith, of W.G. Grace and Matthew Bondman, of the throne of the House of David and Vanity Fair. They were a trinity, 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, the Gospel according to St. Matthew, Murphy being the son of Thomas, otherwise called Arnold of Rugby." End quote. C.L.R. James, Beyond a Boundary, 1963. So here we are, Chapter 6, Parties and Politics in the West Indies. The year 1958 represents the first time James had set foot on native soil in 26 years. Although he had a young son, James was fast approaching old age. The occasion of his return was an arranged invitation from the British-appointed Governor-General of the West Indies to take part in the opening ceremonies of the Transitional Federal Parliament. This provided the pretext for the return home. James and Selma were met at the airport by two island notables, the librarian Carlton Coma and his younger brother Eric James. Who had made a name for himself both as a general manager of the Trinidad Government Railway and as secretary of the Trinidad Football Association. Eric and Olive received their older brother with open arms, even though C.L.R. had been an uneven correspondent after relocating to Europe. If asked, the siblings allowed that they were proud of their brother's accomplishments, but refrained from offering any specific opinion about his political proclivities. Initially, C.L.R. only intended to stay in Trinidad for a few months, but within hours of his arrival he was entertaining offers from friends in the nationalist movement to put his voice and expertise at the service of the national cause. Eric Williams in particular was keen on having James work for the up-and-coming People's National Movement, a new political party. James would work in an advisory capacity, perhaps, or as an editor, pamphleteer, and journalist. As evidence of his firm commitment to this obviously controversial figure, Williams helped arrange James's appointment as secretary of the West Indian Federal Labor Party, a formal alliance of progressive nationalist forces in the region. Yet it soon became clear that the two men could never really work together on the same political stage, and that the radical idealism of the nation's most infamous expatriate was incompatible with the cautious realism of parliamentary politics in the West Indies. In fact, the Jameses quietly left the country in 1962 to return to Britain just days before Trinidad and Tobago's full independence was officially declared and celebrated. It may be wondered what James hoped to achieve through his participation in the nationalist movement. James had little interest in building a Caribbean workers' party, nor was he inclined to restrict himself to primarily literary matters as he had done in the 1920s. Yet some aspects of the past were clearly a source of inspiration. For example, his efforts in this period were informed by the sort of Pan-Africanism he had embraced in the 1930s. His call for a political and economic federation of the new nations of the West Indies had a Pan-African flavor and was designed in part to inspire similar initiatives in Africa and elsewhere. In addition, he wrote on Afrocentric themes and movements in articles published in Trinidadian newspapers, and took a well-publicized trip to West Africa in 1960 to revisit the former Gold Coast, where his old comrade Kwame Nkrumah had led the Convention People's Party to power 3 years earlier. As one might expect, James took a, quote, macro perspective on these events. His involvement in West Indian affairs was at least partly animated by his concern for the contribution that the region could make to the wider struggle for Pan-African/Third World emancipation. In a series of articles and speeches, several of which were reprinted in Party Politics in the West Indies, published in 1962, James tentatively raised the question of what sort of steps should be taken by forward-looking Caribbeans in the post-colonial period. I'm not seeing anything for that book. As an anti-Stalinist and a Marxist, James dismissed the possibility of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, and James did not foreground the transition to a pan-Caribbean or global socialism in his political propaganda. There was a sense that James's ideas concerning the future of the West Indies had a decidedly modest character. If James's conception of independence was at all ambitious or radical, it was in the way James saw social and cultural matters as integral to the construction of a viable model of post-colonial development. For James, the creative act could become the very essence of the nationalist project. Novelists, poets, musicians, and other artists had a critical role to play in advancing the national and democratic agenda. If there was one overriding mission adopted by James in this period, then, it was to help articulate a specifically West Indian identity. This was a task of some complexity. The people of the West Indies represented an agglomeration of several distinct yet overlapping histories and cultures, and their relationship to British and more generally Western traditions was both long-standing and problematic. On the island of Trinidad itself, there was a variety of ethnic groups, with Afro-Caribbeans and Indo-Caribbeans in particular divided along religious, cultural, geographic, and often economic lines. Although the People's National Movement sometimes billed itself as an all-peoples organization, it manifested a definite tilt toward the Afro-Caribbean population. Wikipedia says, the People's National Movement is the longest-serving and oldest active political party in Trinidad and Tobago. The party has dominated national and local politics for much of Trinidad and Tobago's history, contesting all elections since 1956, serving as the nation's governing party, or on 4 occasions the main opposition. It is one of the country's 2 main political parties. There have been 4 P&M prime ministers and multiple ministries. The party espoused the principles of liberalism and generally sits at the center to center-left of the political spectrum. The party was founded in 1956 by Eric Williams, who took inspiration from Norman Manley's Democratic Socialist center-left People's National Party in Jamaica. The People's National Movement won the 1956 general election and went on to hold power for an unbroken 30 years. After the death of Eric Williams in 1981, George Chambers led the party. The party was defeated in the 1986 general elections, losing 33-3 to the National Alliance for Reconstruction, NAR. Under the leadership of Patrick Manning, the People's National Movement returned to power in 1991 following the 1990 attempted coup by Jamaat al-Muslimin, but lost power in 1995 to the United National Congress. The People's National Movement lost again to the UNC in the 2000 general elections, but a split in the UNC forced new elections in 2001. These elections resulted in an 18-18 tie between the PNM and the UNC. The president, Arthur N.R. Robinson, appointed Manning as prime minister. Manning was unable to elect a Speaker of the House of Representatives, but won an outright majority in new elections held in 2002 and again in 2007, before losing power in 2010. It returned to power in the 2015 general election under Keith Rowley, where it had its best result since the 1981 general election, winning 51.7% of the popular vote and 23 of the 41 seats. In the 2020 general election, they won the popular vote and a majority in the House of Representatives, winning 22 seats. The party symbol is the Belisier flower, Heliconia Baha'i, and the party's political headquarters is known as the, quote, Belisier House, located in Port of Spain. Historically, the PNM had been supported by a majority of Afro-Trinidadians and Tobagoans and the Creole mulatto population. Thus it is colloquially called the Black Party, the African Party, or the Creole Party. The PNM has its strongest support in cities and urban areas. This was also historically supported by different minorities, such as the Chinese Christian Indians, other than Presbyterian Indians, and Muslims of any ethnicity of the country. The PNM's signature policies and legislative decisions include independence, writing the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, republicanism, the establishment of the Tobago House of Assembly, the Public Transport Service Corporation, the Water Taxi Service, universal preschool, primary and secondary education, universal health care, criminalizing child marriage, and decriminalizing cannabis. In government since the 2015 general election, the party holds an overall majority of 22 out of 41 members of parliament in the House of Representatives and 16 out of 31 members of the Senate. The party has 72 out of the 139 local councilors and is in control of 7 of the 14 regional corporations. Since the 2014 Trinidadian local elections, the party also has 1 out of 12 assembly members in the Tobago House Assembly since the December 2021 Tobago House of Assembly elections. Despite not being a socialist party, the PNM was a member of the Democratic Socialist West Indies Federal Labor Party in the Federal Parliament of the West Indies Federation. From 1957 to 1962, the party includes a semi-autonomous Tobagonian branch known as the Tobago Council of the People's National Movement. As of September 2018, the PNM has 100,000 plus registered members. Back to the text. Although the People's National Movement sometimes billed itself as an all-people's organization, it manifested a definite tilt toward the Afro-Caribbean population. Despite a certain amount of universalist rhetoric, the coming of independence only increased the saliency of race, ethnicity, and other social cleavages. The scene was further complicated by the fact that Tobago, the smaller island that the British affixed to Trinidad to form a single administrative unit, was predominantly rural, whereas many aspects of Trinidadian society and culture were more or less urbanized. Elements of the urban sector were linked, sometimes through ethnic ties, to European elites, while much larger numbers retained familial and emotional ties to the rural areas. As far as the region as a whole was concerned, there was, quote, no common mint of origin, end quote, between the people. And so whatever bonds were forged would have to be based on a, quote, common mint of relations, end quote. Footnote. Next Rettleford quoted in Jervis Anderson's article, Onward and Upward with the Arts, Derek Walcott's Odyssey, published in the New Yorker, December 21st, 1992. End footnote. As we shall find, James was inclined to emphasize the independent contribution that West Indians could make to world civilization as a whole. At the same time, he liked to stress the lasting value of classical Greek and modern European influence in the spheres of art, politics, culture, and morality, and he could be quite scornful of purely Afrocentric conceptions of West Indian identity. Footnote. Quote, the population in the British West Indies have no native civilization at all. People dance bongo and shango, and all this is very artistic and very good, but these have no serious effect upon their general attitude to the world. These populations are essentially westernized, and they've been westernized for centuries. End quote. C.L.R. James, Party Politics in the West Indies. End footnote. Modern Politics, a collection of lectures delivered in 1960, reaffirmed James's belief in the relevance of classical and Western traditions for a New World audience. I summarized the book's analysis toward the end of the chapter. After examining the author's experiences as an impassioned and later somewhat embittered observer participant in the transformation of West Indian politics at the close of the colonial era. New section. Post-war economic growth and the decline of the British Empire provided the essential backdrop for the emergence of independence movements that could reasonably expect to inherit the reins of power in the West Indies as a matter of course. In Trinidad, the organizational expression of cross-class nationalism was the People's Nationalist Movement, or PNM. The PNM's founding conference, held on January 15, 1956, aimed to both inspire the grassroots and reassure the British authorities. The demands that came out of that conference, public investment in the private sector, extensive social services, and, quote, immediate self-government, end quote, hit just the right populist yet responsible note. Footnote. See Selwyn D. Ryan, Race and Nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago. End footnote. The same can be said of its early motto, "Together we aspire, together we achieve." Having attracted favorable notice for his work as a development economist, Eric D. Williams was quietly approached to serve as the leader of the PNM. As an Oxford-educated academic who received a, quote, first in economics, with 10 years' experience as a professional staff member of the Anglo-American Caribbean Commission, Eric Williams turned out to have the appropriate blend of qualities needed at the time. Williams was widely deemed bright, hard-working, and sober-minded. Williams could deliver tightly argued speeches that nevertheless gave voice to popular concerns, and he was exceedingly gifted in the area of organization and political tactics. Williams had come to the attention of the nationalist community as a result of his public denunciation of the Caribbean Commission, quote, with which he had been associated for a decade, end quote. Footnote. See Carrie Fraser's book, Ambivalent Anti-Colonialism, The United States and the Genesis of West Indian Independence. The description of ambivalent anti-colonialism, the United States, and the Genesis of West Indian Independence, 1940 to 1964, by Carrie Fraser says, until recently, historians have defined the Commonwealth Caribbean territories by their relationship with Britain and have attributed little importance to American relations with these territories. Fraser provides a reinterpretation of U.S. policy toward the West Indies since the 1940s. He establishes links between Afro-West Indian groups and the African Americans who successfully influenced both American and British policy in the West Indies. Thus he explores a little understood and little studied aspect of American policy toward Britain's disengagement from empire after 1945 and the way decolonization in the Caribbean helped to shape the pattern and strategy of the Anglo-American relationship from Roosevelt to Kennedy. The book will force a rethinking of American policy toward the West Indies since 1940, the impact of race on American foreign policy, and the historiography of inter-American relations. Back to the text and footnote. While he could sometimes indulge in militant and even racialist rhetoric, Williams eschewed the socialist labor and jealously guarded and conserved his political power. Like James, Eric Williams was a graduate of Queen's Royal College. They had known each other since the 1920s, and both men have profited from a friendship that survived despite their obvious differences, which were both political and stylistic. James's complicated and problematic relationship with the younger PNM leader proved to be the brittle linchpin of his involvement in the nationalist movement. As the personal connection fractured, the wider relationship was undermined. Once frozen out of the PNM, James found it difficult to situate himself as an effective actor in Trinidadian politics. In its early years, the PNM carefully negotiated a middle ground between its mass Afro-Caribbean following and middle-class base. In mediating these divergent group interests, the party often shifted politically and tactically from one position to another. A pugnacious Albert Gomez complained that, quote, Dr. Williams and his party have been zigzagging along the political road since 1956, alternately driving to the left and to the right, ... end quote. Footnote, quoted in Ryan, Race and Nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago. As it zigzagged along, the PNM secured seats on the British Colonial Office's Legislative Council and launched several projects aimed at consolidating popular support for the nationalist cause. Among the most successful of these was the so-called University of Woodford Square, where Williams and other party leaders spoke to assembled crowds of many thousands. Footnote. At one point, Williams announced that the quote, only university in which I shall lecture in the future is the University of Woodford Square, and its several branches throughout the length and breadth of Trinidad and Tobago, end quote. Williams, quoted in Jeremy Taylor, Masquerade, published in 1986. Jeremy Taylor. Not seeing any good descriptions for this book. And footnote. A delighted George Lamming was able to report that the, quote, middle classes have actually taken to mixing with the peasants and longshoremen who attend the lectures in the University of Woodford Square, end quote. The administrative center of public authority and port of Spain, Woodford Square became a symbol-laden site for the movement as it staked its claim to political legitimacy. Footnote. George Lamming, The Pleasures of Exile, published 1960 originally and republished in 1984. I think I might have already looked this book up actually in previous chapters, but in The Pleasures of Exile, as in his other works, George Lamming embraces the intricate issues of colonization and decolonization with a canny combination of playfulness and seriousness, irony and commitment. Quote, it is a reciprocal process, end quote. Lamming observes, quote, to be a colonial is to be a man in a certain relation, and this relation is an example of exile, end quote. Through a series of interrelated essays, The Pleasures of Exile explores the cultural politics and relationships created in the crucible of colonization. Drawing on Shakespeare's The Tempest and C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, as well as his own fiction and poetry, Lamming deftly locates the reader in a specific intellectual and cultural domain while conjuring a rich and varied spectrum of physical, intellectual, psychological, and cultural responses to colonialism. Quote, my subject, James writes, I don't know why I said James. My subject, Lamming writes, quote, is the migration of the West Indian writer as colonial in exile from his native kingdom, once inhabited by Caliban, to the tempestuous island of Prosperos, and his language. This book is a report on one man's way of seeing, end quote. Lamming. End footnote. Footnote. The Red House, an imposing neo-Renaissance edifice located on the western side of Woodford Square, is the historic seat of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, and housed the P&M government after independence. The building was rebuilt in 1906 after being destroyed 3 years earlier by rioters. End footnote. As a result of its black-centered, urban-based anti-colonialism, and through its ability to seize the political initiative, the P&M quickly eclipsed an older generation of political figures and captured the nationalist high ground. It was in this, quote, nationalist whirlwind, end quote, that an astonished James entered in April 1958. Footnote. See Basil Wilson's article, The Caribbean Revolution, in Paul Boole's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Life and Work. End footnote. According to one eyewitness, James told Williams that, quote, with a movement like this, you can do anything, end quote. Footnote. Ivar Oxall, Black Intellectuals Come to Power, published 1968, end footnote. Williams returned the compliment, for it was a compliment as well as an observation, by inviting his friend to stay and work for the People's National Movement in an official capacity. With George Padmore, they had already discussed the P&M strategy during Williams' visit to London in 1956, but Williams' offer entailed a much larger role than the occasional consultation. It was inspired by Williams' affection for a capable old friend, as well as by a calculated appreciation for the way in which the polished intellectual's presence could protect Williams' left flank and provide the P&M with a useful patina of unorthodoxy. On James's part, the decision to stay was at least partly motivated by the sense that West Indian society was in motion and that something new and interesting could emerge as a result. The unpleasant part was that he would have to shed his independent Marxist identity, at least temporarily. In the interest of party unity, James promised Williams he would curb his political rhetoric and anti-leadership tendencies. Footnote: halfway through Natives of My Person, the James-like character Surgeon announces, quote, "I put the past behind me. That very moment, I gave the commandment my word," end quote. See George Lamming, Natives of My Person. End footnote. The P&M did in fact shift leftwards, in part as a result of James's influence. From all appearances, Williams placed great value on the older man's political judgment, and some younger nationalists were attracted to James' eclectic blend of revolutionary commitment and Victorian decorum. Footnote: later there would be profound skepticism as leftist nationalists chastised James for his identification with Western values and for his failure to construct an alternative to the P&M. Criticisms of this kind were raised at the conference. C. L. R. James's intellectual legacies held at Wellesley College in 1991. I refer to these issues in my chapter on The Question of the Canon, C. L. R. James and Modern Politics, in Paget Henry and Paul Boole's edited volume, C. L. R. James's Caribbean. End footnote. Others thought that the legendary activist carried excessive ideological baggage. Quote, "For over a year, Nello was number 2 in the party," end quote, worried one party leader. Quote, "In fact, there were times when we thought he might be number 1, end quote. Footnote, quoted in Oxall, Black Intellectuals Come to Power, page 120, end footnote. Kamaluddin Muhammad and Gerard Montano and other P&M figures were concerned that James would seek to inject Trotskyist or communist doctrines into the party's political program. Not seeing any good descriptions of Kamaluddin Muhammad. Gerard Montano. The American Consulate General was sufficiently wrought up to send his superiors in Washington, D.C., a rather ominous report. Quote, "Although the Consulate General has no evidence, there is always the possibility that James is under international communist discipline and continues to use his Trotsky identification as a cloak. It is rumored locally that James has access to communist money," end quote. Footnote, quoted in Fraser, Ambivalent Anti-Colonialism. Fraser goes to report, quote, "Despite the lack of evidence, the Consul General saw James as a threatening figure within the P&M. The fact that Williams was close to James, whose party-building activities and views increased his influence, was also a source of concern," end quote. End footnote. Fueling these concerns about the possibility of, quote, communist infiltration, the People's National Movement took a populist turn during the winter of 1958 to 1959. Evidence for this turn could be found in the document Perspectives for Our Party, prepared in October 1958 for the PNM's third convention. Officially penned by Williams, several passages bore the imprint of the chieftain's controversial new advisor. In one passage, Williams' ghostwriter asserted that, quote, in Trinidad and Tobago and in the West Indies, a conception of the new society has developed, to the point where the old situation will never again prevail, end quote. The passage went on to claim that, quote, this is not merely a theory. In practice, the PNM has tackled the big boys, end quote. Footnote. Eric Williams, article, Perspectives for Our Party, 1958, reprinted in Eric E. Williams Speaks, Essays on Colonialism and Independence. Republished in 1993. End footnote. Both the, quote, new society and the, quote, big boys phraseology is unmistakably Jamesian, as is the call to, quote, build our party organization from the bottom up, end quote, and, quote, reorganize our system of education so that through the party it penetrates into the deepest masses of the people, end quote. Williams. In this document, Williams/James proposed that the party initiate a program of political education, extend contact with progressive nationalist forces abroad, erect a party headquarters, and generally overhaul the party's internal apparatus and public profile. The overall point was that the PNM could become a special kind of political organization, a campaigning party rather than an electoral machine. While the document's proposals were not couched in explicitly socialist terms, traces of James's experiences in a variety of radical movements was evident. Moving on from drafting party documents, James was offered the job of editing the PNM's newspaper. His political enemies could not have been pleased. Relaunched in December 1958, The Nation was the party's premier recruiting tool and political journal. Boasting a print run of several thousand, CLR James, Selma James, and a sizable technical and editorial staff created a brash, argumentative news weekly that walked a thin line between promoting PNM policies and pushing the mass movement forward. Selma James worked tirelessly on the paper, as did their friend Walter Anumontodo, a Guyanese-born activist and pamphleteer who served as the paper's sub-editor. Footnote. Walter Anumontodo's loyalty was to CLR rather than to the People's National Movement. He claimed later that, quote, I could not have broken with James, not on penalty of death, end quote. See Lewis B. Homer, We Shall See What We Shall See, published in the Trinidad and Tobago Review, October 1992. James wrote an introduction to Anumontodo's pamphlet, Sugar Dissected, which he privately published in 1966, and which James described as a, quote, little masterpiece, in contrast to the, quote, babble of tongues, which to a large degree constitutes politics in Trinidad and Tobago, end quote. Let's look up Walter Anumontodo's, or Walter Anumontodo? I'm not seeing any good descriptions of him. Early on, James described the Nation as the, quote, established spearhead of the party militant and the textbook of independence, end quote. Footnote. Quoted in Ryan, Race and Nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago, page 214. The PNM's chief organ of political propaganda, end footnote. The PNM's chief organ of political propaganda featured an unusual mix of historical essays, short news items, cultural commentary, sports journalism, and columns by Dr. Williams and others. The idea was to produce a paper that was as entertaining as it was informative and accessible to the widest possible range of readers. According to one promotional advertisement, the paper offered a, quote, vital alternative to the established press. Quote, so dishonest are our daily newspapers that The Nation, a weekly constantly has to report vital news that the people otherwise would never know. Support the nation. It is a national duty. And by nation, he means the magazine. End quote. The overworked editors felt no hesitation in running CLR James's own pieces in the paper. In addition to writing the lead editorial, James often provided the front page news story and a regular column that appeared under the title Without Malice. Longer essays were also featured. A couple of these were reprinted as P&M pamphlets. One such pamphlet, Our Upper Classes, sought to reassure nervous Europeans that the, quote, P&M is not some monstrous misfortune which has overtaken the unfortunate upper class in Trinidad and Tobago. Something like the P&M was due in Trinidad sooner or later. It is one of the features of modern society, end quote. James, Our Upper Classes. In certain respects, The Nation was modeled on the Detroit Correspondence. Both papers were aimed at a mass audience, both featured articles on cultural and social questions, and both encouraged feedback from readers. Like Correspondence, The Nation strived to transpose broadly socialist themes into a native idiom. In their effort to go beyond social democratic or liberal nationalist rhetoric, the Jameses were able to draw upon a more relevant model than Cannon's Militant or Lenin's Iskra. The growing impact of The Nation, the magazine, matched the political success of the People's National Movement as a whole. Whereas the party secured nearly 40% of the popular vote in elections held in 1956, it obtained an impressive 57% of the vote in 1961. Yet the party, like its newspaper, was primarily rooted in the Afro-Caribbean section of the population, and its ties among, quote, West Indians of East Indian descent, end quote, were weak at best. Footnote. This was the title of James's 1960 what's the footnote number? This was the title of James' 1960 pamphlet that attempted to reassure the country's Indian population of the P&M's benign intentions. From the outset, the P&M vacillated over whether it was a universalist party or whether it should build on its special relationship to the black community. Some Indians charged Williams with a propensity to, quote, play the race card when he deemed it advantageous. Footnote. A more nuanced view was offered by Winston Mahabir in his autobiography. Mahabir, an Indian Christian and a physician, was a member of the P&M's cabinet prior to independence. In his book, he writes, quote, it would be a gross distortion to lay blame for the recrudescence of racial antagonisms at the door of Eric Williams and the P&M. It would be equally unrealistic to explicate Eric Williams entirely. As the leading politician in Trinidad since 1956, Williams had an unrivaled opportunity to exercise a positive influence upon the betterment of race relations. Yet my impression was that, although Eric Williams had a firm intellectual grasp of the need for cooperation between the races, he never made any serious attempt to bridge the emotional gap that lay between him and the Indians, end quote. Dr. Winston Mahabir, in Out of Politics, published in Port of Spain, 1978. End footnote. Not surprisingly, James's main electoral challenge came from a party that enjoyed far stronger links to Indo-Caribbeans, both Hindu and Muslim, as well as the Catholic hierarchy. Led by Badassa Miraj and Dr. Rudranath Capildeo, the Democratic Labor Party formed in 1958, came to offer a perennial quasi-sectionalist-based challenge to the P&M. According to Wikipedia, the Democratic Labor Party was the main opposition party in Trinidad and Tobago from 1957 until 1976. The Democratic Labor Party was the party which opposed the People's National Movement at the time of independence. After several splits brought about leadership struggles, the party lost its hold on the Indo-Trinidadian community in the 1976 general elections and was displaced in Parliament by the United Labour Front under the leadership of Besdeo Pandey, former DLP senator. The party was the representative of the ethnic Indian community in the country. However, Indian Muslims and Christians were said to be less loyal to the party than Indian Hindus. The party symbol was a flaming torch. Wikipedia says Badas Maraj lived from 1920 to 1971 and was a Trinidad and Tobago politician, Hindu leader, civil rights activist, trade unionist, landowner, businessman, philanthropist, wrestler, and writer. He founded the Sanatan Dharma Mahasabha in 1952, which grew to be the largest and most influential Hindu organization in Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean. Badas Maraj also founded the Caroni East Indian Association, the People's Democratic Party, the Democratic Labor Party, the Democratic Liberation Party, the Federation of Unions of Sugar Workers and Cane Farmers, and the Bomb newspaper. And Renat Capildeo lived from 1920 to 1970 and was a Trinidadian and Tobagoan politician, mathematician, and barrister. He was a member of the prominent Hindu Indo-Trinidadian Capildeo family. Capildeo was the leader of the Democratic Labor Party from 1960 to 1969 and the first leader of the opposition in the Parliament of the independent Trinidad and Tobago from 1962 to 1967. Rudranath Capildeo was also a faculty member of the University of London, eventually holding the position of Reader of Mathematics. He was awarded the Trinity Cross, the nation's highest award, in 1969. Back to the text. The Democratic Labor Party was eventually succeeded by the National Alliance for Reconstruction. The National Alliance for Reconstruction was the governing party in Trinidad and Tobago between 1986 and 1991. The party has been inactive since 2005. Its ideology was social liberalism and social democracy. The Democratic Labor Party was eventually succeeded by the National Alliance for Reconstruction, which achieved power under the austerity program of A.N.R. Robinson in the mid-1980s. Wikipedia says A.N.R. Robinson was a Trinidadian politician who lived from 1926 to 2014. He was the third president of the country, serving from the 19th of March 1997 to the 17th of March 2003. He was also Trinidad and Tobago's third Prime Minister, serving in that capacity from the 18th of December 1986 to the 17th of December 1991. He is recognized for his proposal that eventually led to the founding of the International Criminal Court. Anne Robinson was the first active politician to be elected to the presidency and was the first presidential candidate who was not elected unopposed. The opposition People's National Movement nominated Justice Anthony Luckey as its candidate for president. President Robinson sparked controversy in his term in office when he refused to appoint certain senators recommended by Prime Minister Basdeo Panday following the election of 2000 and 2001, when he appointed the leader of the opposition, Patrick Manning, to the position of Prime Minister after a tied election. Back to the text. Under James' brief tenure, the nation kept cross-party or intra-ethnic sniping to a minimum, but James nevertheless was to come under heavy fire for associating with a racialist party. One DLP supporter, Trinidadian Hindu H.P. Singh, strongly attacked James for deigning to lecture Indians about politics. Not finding any descriptions for him. Quote, "It is really amusing," Singh writes, quote, "that you, Mr. James, you spent almost your time or life away from Trinidad, should appeal to Indians here to make their Trinidad into something. That is unadulterated jingoism," end quote. Singh accused James of having a perverse interest in breaking up the Indian family through liberal sexual values and miscegenation. Quote, "Negro intellectualism, judging from Mr. James's reasoning, seems to be interested more in sexual union between Indians and Negroes than in unity of minds between the two races," end quote. Singh. Footnote. See H.P. Singh, The Indian Enigma, a review of Mr. C.L.R. James's West Indians of East Indian Descent, or a study in Coolitude, published in 1965. This pamphlet, along with a number of other polemics aimed at Eric Williams and the PNM, has been reprinted in H.P. Singh, The Indian Struggle for Justice and Equality Against Black Racism in Trinidad and Tobago, edited by Kamal Prasad and Ashram B. Maharaj, Quva. I'm not seeing any descriptions for that book. Back to the text and footnote. As befitting his status as a national figure, Williams is more often the target of this kind of acrimonious attention than James, however. The paper's finest hour may have arrived during the winter of 1960, when it intervened vigorously in the arena of international sports by advocating the appointment of Frank Worrell as captain of the West Indian cricket team. Wikipedia says Sir Frank Mortimer Magline Worrell, who lived from 1924 to 1967, sometimes referred to by his nickname as Tay, was a Barbadian West Indies cricketer and Jamaican senator. A stylish right-handed batsman and useful left-arm seam bowler, he became famous in the 1950s as the second black captain of the West Indies cricket team. Along with Everton Weekes and Clyde Walcott, Frank Worrell formed what was known as the, quote, 3 Ws of the West Indian cricket. He was the first batter to have been involved in 2 500-run partnerships, and remained the only one until Ravindra Jadeja emulated him in the 2010s. The Frank Worrell Trophy is awarded to the winner of the frequent Test series between Australia and West Indies. Frank Worrell spent some time studying economics and playing in England. A memorial service was held in his honor in Westminster Abbey, the first such honor for a sportsman. In 2009, Worrell was inducted into the ICC Cricket Hall of Fame. He is widely regarded as the Nelson Mandela of cricket. Back to the text. Worrell was a black man, and the West Indian team had always been led by a European. As James wrote in his column, quote, "It is the constant, vigilant, bold, and shameless manipulation of players to exclude black captains that has so demoralized West Indian teams and exasperated the people. The more brilliantly the black men played, the more it would emphasize to millions of English people, quote, yes, they are fine players, but funny, isn't it? They cannot be responsible for themselves. They must always have a white man to lead them," end quote. End quote. Footnote, quoted in the article by Jervis Anderson, Cricket and Beyond, published in American Scholar, summer 1985. James vowed to, quote, "clean up this captaincy mess once and for all," end quote. After several solid weeks of journalistic agitation which stirred up popular resentment against the implicit whites-only policy, Frank Worrell was appointed captain of the West Indies team, quote, "the first black captain in the history of representative cricket," end quote. Anderson. Other campaigns proved less successful. For many months, the paper advocated West Indian Federation. The topic of federation had been of enduring interest to the middle classes in the Caribbean. Its appeal gathered strength once politicians and intellectuals came into contact with each other through the aegis of regional institutions such as the University of the West Indies, which opened in 1948. Given the geographic and economic constraints facing the region, a federation of Jamaica, Trinidad, the Windward and Leeward Islands, and now British Guyana, was seen by many as the only solid basis on which a sustainable independence could be constructed. As the Colonial Office admitted in 1945, quote, "It has become more difficult for very small units, whatever their outward political form may be, to maintain full and complete independence in all respects of government," end quote. Footnote, quoted in Earl Gooding, West Indies at the Crossroads, published in 1989. Not seeing any good descriptions for that book, end footnote. The cause of federation gained considerable momentum in the late 1940s, in part as a result of a 1945 U.S. speaking tour that allowed two West Indian politicians, Grantley Adams from Barbados and Norman Manley from Jamaica, to create a network of pro-federation sympathizers. Wikipedia says Grantley Adams lived from 1898 to 1971 and was a Barbadian politician. He served as the inaugural Premier of Barbados from 1954 to 1958 and then became the first and only Prime Minister of the West Indies Federation from 1958 to 1962. Grantley Adams was a founder of the Barbados Labour Party, and Adams was named in 1998 as one of the national heroes of Barbados. Norman Manley lived from 1893 to 1969 and was a Jamaican statesman who served as the first and only Premier of Jamaica. A Rhodes Scholar, Manley became one of Jamaica's leading lawyers in the 1920s. Manley was an advocate of universal suffrage and was granted by the British colonial government, to to the colony in 1944. Encouraged by Osmond Theodore Fairclough, who had joined forces with the brothers Frank and Ken Hill, Hedley P. Jacobs, and others in 1938, he helped to launch the People's National Party, which later was affiliated to the Trade Union Congress and even later the National Workers' Union. Norman Manley led the PNP in every election from 1944 to 1967. Their efforts resulted in the new Constitution of 1944, granting full adult suffrage. Norman Manley served as the colony's chief minister from 1955 to 1959 and as premier from 1959 to 1962. Norman Manley was a proponent of self-government but was persuaded to join 9 other British colonies in the Caribbean territories in a federation of the West Indies, but called a referendum on the issue in 1961. Voters chose to have Jamaica withdraw from the Union. He then opted to call a general election even though his 5-year mandate was barely halfway through. Back to the text. One of their allies was Eric Williams, who was teaching at Howard University at the time. Through the work of the Caribbean Labor Congress, Grantley Adams and Norman Manley further expanded their network and put pressure on the British authorities to pursue decolonization in such a way as to facilitate the emergence of a post-colonial federation. Their efforts provided an important backdrop to the decision taken in the early 1950s to open up negotiations between the Colonial Office and West Indian political parties regarding the transition to a federated West Indies. It was agreed that a loosely structured federation, with its own parliament, would be formed in 1958, and that subsequent negotiations would establish the precise configuration of a potential political and economic union. James was strongly committed to the ideal of federation, which James saw as essential to the development of black unity and as the only plausible solution to the problem of underdevelopment in the East Caribbean. This was a problem that had both political and economic aspects. Speaking in his capacity as editor of The Nation and as secretary of the West Indian Federal Labor Party, James told an audience in Demerara, British Guyana, that, quote, federation is the means, and the only means, whereby the West Indies and British Guyana can accomplish the transition from colonialism to national independence, can create the basis for a new nation, and by reorganizing the economic system and the national life, give us our place in the modern community of nations, end quote. James, footnote, James, Lecture on Federation, 1958, reprinted in CLR James at the Rendezvous of History, Selected Writings, published in 1986. End footnote. A year later, James insisted at a public lecture in Kingston that Jamaica's economic difficulties could only be attacked through the creation of federal-level planning mechanisms. Quote, I believe, James stated, quote, that the time has come for the state plan. So far, we have been clearing up the imperialist mess. The activity of the last years has been to prepare the ground for a new stage of economy, and that is the economy of the state plan, end quote. James. Footnote, James's article, Federation, What Now? Originally from 1959, reprinted at the Rendezvous of History, end footnote. What James actually meant by this rather centralist phraseology is somewhat murky, although James refers in passing to the need for the government to, quote, decide on a program aiming by stages to try to raise the general level, to satisfy the urgent needs of the people, and, to make an impatient people understand that some serious, tremendous, new, and sustained effort is being made to satisfy the demands which are increasing every day, end quote. James, Federation, What Now? Just what precise mix of private enterprise planning, welfare provision, and other forms of public intervention would emerge as a result of this, quote, program was not clearly specified. What it seems While it seems evident that James was rather loosely trying to map out a post-colonial, quote, third way between free market capitalism and state capitalism, the actual set of proposals James wanted to use seems rather incomplete. There is a voluntarist dimension to James's conception of the political economy of underdevelopment, with the spontaneous initiative of the masses sufficient to smooth over any gaps in the economic logic. The link between this statist economic program and his overall commitment to socialism from below also seems somewhat tenuous. The West Indian scholar Paget Henry finds it striking that James's model of economic transformation, quote, is not constructed from inside the dynamics of the regional labor process, end quote. It says that Paget Henry is professor of sociology and Africana studies at Brown University. Back to the text. Instead, quote, the stress is on the more careful planning of an externally initiated, capital-led process of industrial development, end quote. Paget Henry, quote, it is not, end quote, as one might expect, quote, a worker-led strategy of development based upon an assessment of the organizational forms and capabilities that regional workers have produced or demonstrated in the course of the major insurrectionary activities, end quote. Paget Henry, in C.L.R. James and the Caribbean Economic Tradition, published in Henry and Bull's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Caribbean. One must simply assume that for James, federation was a means of stimulating a mass movement as well as a transitional mode of governance on the road to a more participatory society. Toward this end, the nation tried to keep its readers fully apprised of the progress of the high-level negotiations for federation. The largest obstacle to the creation of this para-state appeared to be the unwillingness of certain forces to cede, in the words of the PNM, quote, common allegiance to a central government, end quote. Footnote, quoted in Ryan, Race and Nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago, page 293, end footnote. In particular, the Jamaicans seemed reluctant to share their sovereignty with other West Indians. Although Norman Manley had long backed the concept of federation, influential members of his party feared that the drift toward federation was premature and that any likely arrangement would be inequitable from a Jamaican point of view. As one of the larger and oldest of the former British colonies in the West Indies, Jamaica's participation was seen as crucial to the success of the project. Footnote, a detailed account of the divergent role of Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados in the Federation project is contained in Hoyos's Grantley Adams and the Social Revolution, the story of the movement that changed the pattern of West Indian society, published in 1988. I don't see any description for this book. Carrie Fraser's book provides another useful overview of the rise and fall of the Federalist Project. Daniel Guerin also addressed the topic of federation in his political survey of the West Indies. In the book's very last paragraph, Guerin asks, quote, but why deceive ourselves? The West Indian Confederation has slight chance of being born within the framework of the present capitalist and colonial society. 16 years ago, in 1945, the Caribbean Labor Congress forcefully affirmed, quote, that there is no hope for the West Indies unless they become a socialist commonwealth, end quote, end quote. Daniel Guerin, The West Indies and Their Future, published in 1961. And the description that I'm seeing here just says, for West Indies and Their Future by Danielle Green says, comparative history of the Caribbean peoples unified by common social conditions. End footnote. Manley sought to resolve his domestic dilemma by calling for a nationwide referendum on the issue of federation. This produced an anti-federation vote, 54% against, in September 1961. In the aftermath of the Jamaican referendum, the Provisional Federation was dissolved and negotiations called off. James later blamed the region's leaders for failing to mobilize popular support around the project. James promised that West Indians would return to the project of building a federation, arguing that there was finally no other way forward. But more than a few politicians grew to appreciate the relative autonomy furnished by the status quo. Both the campaign for Frank Worrell and the controversy over the Federation added to the tensions between James, with his reputation for unpredictability, and the more conservative clique around Eric Williams. The state-managed resolution of the so-called Chaguaramas affair had an even greater adverse impact on James's position within the movement. I don't see like a real good description of this, but the AI overview says the Chaguaramas affair is a topic related to the Treaty of Chaguaramas, which established the Caribbean Community and Common Market in 1973. The treaty was signed by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. The treaty's objectives included improving standards of living, increasing trade, and enhancing international competitiveness. Chaguaramas, a district of northwest Trinidad, had been used by the U.S. military as a naval base after the British had, quote, leased territory on some of the West Indian colonies to the United States in exchange for military equipment, end quote, during World War II. The U.S. was the beneficiary of several similar arrangements in other parts of the world, which came about largely as an unanticipated consequence of the British debt, and the Americans used their new access to British sites to adopt and reinforce a Cold War posture. Advocates of political reform had come to resent this arrangement on the grounds that it symbolized the lack of input that West Indians had into their own affairs. Although the PNM raised the issue of Chaguarama's peculiar constitutional status in part to safeguard its position at the head of the nationalist movement, the campaign was clearly rooted in popular feelings. The issue seemed to resonate particularly among Afro-Caribbeans, and Williams may have used Chaguaramas to highlight the contrast between his party's own resolutely nationalist base and that of its, quote, traitorous political opponents. Hoyos simply reports that Williams, quote, drew his strength from the support of the mass of the people, end quote, and that, quote, the campaign captured the imagination of Trinidad and other territories of the Caribbean, end quote. Williams called on the United States and the British to sit down in three-way negotiation with the PNM to arrive at a more equitable arrangement, one that recognized the legitimate aspirations of the West Indian people. A 1960 demonstration intended to bring the U.S. authorities to the bargaining table, known as the, quote, March in the Rain, proved, in retrospect, to have been, quote, the militant high point of Trinidadian nationalism, end quote. Oxel, Black Intellectuals Come to Power. Sorry, I was trying to look up the if there's anything from March in the Rain. Negotiations opened in Port of Spain in June 1960 and were attended by the British Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. Wikipedia says Harold Macmillan lived from 1894 to 1986 and was a British statesman and conservative politician who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1957 to 1963, nicknamed Super Mac. Harold Macmillan was known for his pragmatism, wit, and unflappability. Harold Macmillan was seriously injured as an infantry officer during the First World War. Macmillan suffered pain and partial immobility for the rest of his life. After the war, Harold Macmillan joined his family book publishing business, then entered Parliament at the 1924 general election for Stockton-on-Tees. Losing his seat in 1929, Harold Macmillan regained it in 1931, soon after which he spoke out against the high rate of unemployment in Stockton. Harold Macmillan opposed the appeasement of Germany practiced by the conservative government. Harold Macmillan rose to high office during the Second World War as a protege of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In the 1950s, Macmillan served as Foreign Secretary and Chancellor of the Exchequer under Anthony Eden. When Eden resigned in 1957 following the Suez Crisis, Macmillan succeeded him as Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party. He was a one-nation Tory of the Disraelian tradition and supported the post-war consensus. Harold Macmillan supported the welfare state and the necessity of a mixed economy with some nationalized industries and strong trade unions. Harold Macmillan championed a Keynesian strategy of deficit spending to maintain demand in pursuit of corporatist policies to develop the domestic market as the engine of growth. Benefiting from favorable international conditions, Harold Macmillan presided over an age of affluence, marked by low unemployment and high, if uneven growth. In Harold Macmillan's speech of July 1957, he told the nation it had, quote, never had it so good, end quote, but warned of the dangers of inflation, summing up the fragile prosperity of the 1950s. Harold Macmillan led the Conservatives to success in 1959 with an increased majority. In international affairs, Harold Macmillan worked to rebuild a special relationship with the United States from the wreckage of the 1956 Suez Crisis, of which he had been one of the architects, and facilitated the decolonization of Africa, reconfiguring the nation's defenses to meet the realities of the nuclear age. Harold Macmillan ended national service, strengthening the nuclear forces by acquiring Polaris, and pioneered the nuclear test ban with the United States and the Soviet Union. After the Skybolt crisis undermined the Anglo-American strategic relationship, Harold Macmillan sought a more active role for Britain in Europe, but his unwillingness to disclose United States nuclear secrets to France contributed to a French veto of the United Kingdom's entry into the European Economic Community, an independent French acquisition of nuclear weapons in 1960. Near the end of his premiership, Harold Macmillan's government was rocked by the Vassal Tribunal and the Profumo affair, which to cultural conservatives and supporters of opposing parties alike seemed to symbolize moral decay of the British establishment. Following Harold Macmillan's resignation, Harold Macmillan lived out a long retirement as an elder statesman, being an active member of the House of Lords in his final years. He died in December 1986 at the age of 92. Back to the text. In September 1960, it was announced that the U.S. would release 21,000 acres, keep the rest for 17 years, and provide $30 million in international development money to be spent on road construction and education. The bargaining process was no doubt smoothed by William's declaration in May 1960 that Trinidad was, quote, west of the quote, Iron Curtain. During the negotiations, Williams began to dissociate himself from James. Quote, Williams was turning away from close personal contact with his old mentor, end quote, according to Oxall. Quote, there is a strong suspicion that the Americans demanded James's, quote, scalp as part of the Chaguaramas settlement, end quote, writes another historian. Footnote: Ryan, Race and Nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago, page 231. For an overview of U.S. policy in the decolonization process, see Carrie Fraser's article, Understanding American Policy Towards the Decolonization of Eastern Empires, 1945 to 1964, published in Diplomacy and Statecraft, Volume 3, Number 1, March 1992. End footnote. Seemingly unaware of these machinations, James took note of William's tactical shift and went so far as to say that he too would now modulate his political rhetoric. Footnote: During the Chaguaramas affair, James had written that the Americans demonstrated, quote, incredible thick-headedness and bovine obstinacy. A sense of power and the arrogance of dominion seems to shut off the functioning of certain parts of the brain, end quote. C.L.R. James, The Nation, August 7, 1959. James adopted a different rhetoric in articles such as Dr. Eric Williams, P&M Political Leader, A Convention Appraisal, published in March 1960. End footnote. More was at stake, however, than a question of tonality. James's entire intellectual and political style had always been viewed by party insiders as a liability to the P&M, and with the compromise of Chaguaramas and the failure of the P&M to capitalize on its popularity among the people, James experienced sharp feelings of alienation from the party. On the 26th of March 1960, prior to traveling to Ghana, James wrote to Eric Williams, asking to be, quote, relieved from my post at the Nation, ... too many people, end quote, he said, quote, seem to have forgotten or never knew that I am a person with definite political principles and attitudes. I have subordinated myself to the P&M completely. I can do so no longer, end quote. James. In July, James sent Williams a final letter stating that, quote, I'm not going to work at the Nation anymore, ... I couldn't carry on there if I wanted to, end quote. James, quoted in Party Politics in the West Indies, page 96. Judging from the contents of the Nation, the party's apparatus had engineered a relatively trouble-free transition from the period between March and July 1960, where James's articles were run but editorial control was being shifted elsewhere. The party gave the appearance of being Janus-faced regarding the paper's ousted editor-in-chief. On the one hand, at the party's fifth convention, delegates asked, apparently with official sanctions, that James return to his editorial post. A convention resolution commented on the fact that, quote, the absence of Mr. James at the Nation as editor has already diminished substantially the effectiveness of the paper as a vital sinew of the party, ... end quote. On the other hand, at the same convention, party leaders circulated an internal document that charged James with, quote, mismanagement. Quote, given a free hand, James appeared to use it freely without regard for his own or the company's responsibilities, end quote. Footnote, quoted in Eric Williams, Inward Hunger, The Education of a Prime Minister. The description of Eric Williams' Inward Hunger, The Education of a Prime Minister says, quote, when the author, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, was a lad, his country was a British Crown colony and its government offered one university scholarship a year to the entire population. Young Williams won it and went off to Oxford to study history and politics. Williams became an authority on West Indian history and back home founded the People's National Movement Party, which repeatedly returned him to office. Mr. Williams' education has endowed him with a lucid style, and despite his dedication to his homeland, a mind that is anything but insular. This account of his efforts to make a new nation closes in 1968. One looks forward to another installment, end quote. That's a review from The New Yorker. In the meantime, this autobiography has become a classic in African Caribbean history, This edition features an introduction by Colin Palmer of Princeton University, the author of Passageways, an interpretive history of Black America. Back to the text and footnote. These charges were used to justify James's expulsion from the PNM in October 1960. Thus, his first and penultimate encounter with the responsibilities of electoralism ended abruptly and with remarkably little fuss. Having spent several decades in the socialist trenches, James was unsuited for the rather different demands and constraints of electoral politics. After being ejected from the PNM, James was freer to advance his own views of West Indian development and industry. The book Party Politics in the West Indies offers a particularly useful point of entry into his thinking in this period. The first half of the book had been circulated inside the People's National Movement during the winter of 1960 under the title PNM Go Forward. Party Politics coupled this pamphlet with a collection of essays addressing West Indian sociology and culture. The underlying logic of the book was that an invigorated PNM should go beyond the confines of a routinized electoralism and try and engage the masses. This would require finding some way to link up with artistic and cultural currents that were, by their very nature, unlikely to gravitate toward purely political or instrumental forms of activity. Quote, PNM Go Forward is marked by a rather embattled, almost self-involved tone. Written in something of a hurry, the document seeks to justify the author's position vis-a-vis the PNM in the aftermath of the Chugorama's compromise and the clandestine battle over the nation. It documents a series of occasions when the author was betrayed or rebuffed and offers a critique of the PNM's drift to the right. 3 criticisms are of particular note. The first was that the party had failed to provide the party newspaper with sufficient resources or to use it to build a loyal following among the people. James strongly believed that the paper should have come out as often as twice a week. Quote, I am dissatisfied, James wrote, quote, with a nation which needs the concentrated attention of an editor and more than ever with a perspective twice a week. End quote. James, Party Politics in the West Indies, page 70. Indeed, he suggested that the paper should have appeared on a daily basis, a proposal that would have required an extraordinary commitment of the party's resources. The second criticism was that the PNM had become dominated by one man, Dr. Williams, who aggregated power unilaterally. Williams, it was said, was loath to relinquish authority to permit independent centers of power to emerge inside the party. Quote, it is common knowledge that only committees on which the premier is active carry out any activity at all, end quote, he noted. Up to the point of his expulsion, James had publicly deferred to the, quote, doctor's wishes and had affected the air of loyal PNM member. All that was now forgotten. Under the pressure of events, the personal rapport that made the 1958 document, Perspectives for Our Party, possible, had dissipated, just as that document's ambitious organizational agenda had been disregarded and ignored. Finally, as a direct consequence of Williams' apparent unwillingness to allow for the consolidation of independent perspectives and tendencies within the PNM, James charged that the party's institutional apparatus was being undermined and neglected. Quote, the organization of the party, the organization of the convention is very defective, end quote, James claimed. Footnote, James, Party Politics in the West Indies, page 51, end footnote. What was needed was an emergency convention to find ways to strengthen the party's internal functioning and organization so that a process of democratization could be facilitated. But where James saw organizational atrophy, the circle around Williams saw progress and development. The party had attracted a loyal mass base, and there was every expectation that the PNM would be asked by the Colonial Office to form a transitional government as part of preparations for independence. Every indication suggested that an orderly transition, such as the one promised by Williams, would maintain the measurable economic growth and prosperity that Trinidad and Tobago had achieved by this time. Footnote, the country's real gross domestic product had increased by 8.5% on an annual basis from 1951 to 1961, 80,000 barrels of oil were being produced per day by 1960. Figures taken from the islands of the Commonwealth Caribbean, a regional study, Washington, D.C., U.S. Government Printing Office, 1989. End footnote. Drafted at a time when the party was enjoying measurable success as a mainstream nationalist formation, quote, P&M Go Forward, failed to resonate beyond a handful of friends and sympathizers. Footnote. Williams remained fully capable of shifting leftwards if the circumstances warranted. Having embraced the West and having engineered the expulsion of the party's leading radical, Williams gave a speech in March 1961, Massa Day 1, which brilliantly affirmed his anti-imperialist credentials. Quote, there was no civilized society on earth so entirely destitute of learned leisure, literary and scientific intercourse, and liberal recreation, end quote, Williams explained, as that of the West Indian plantation economy. Quote, Massa Day done connotes a political awakening and a social revolution, end quote. The speech was widely circulated by the P&M. These quotations are taken from Andrew Salke's Caribbean Essays, published in 1973. End footnote. The second, more compelling half of party politics consisted of 8 essays on cultural and social themes. The thrust of these pieces was that independence and political democracy had to serve some, quote, special purpose. As he argued in the context of a discussion of the West Indian middle classes, quote, the middle classes point to parliamentary democracy, trade unions, party politics, and all the elements of democracy, but these are not things in themselves. They must serve a social purpose, and here the middle classes are near the end of their tether. Some of them are preparing for trouble with the masses. Come what may, they're going to keep them in order. Some are hoping for help from the Americans, from the Organization of American States, end quote. James, The West Indian Middle Classes, reprinted in James's Spheres of Existence, Selected Writings, published in 1980. End footnote. The parochialism and passivity of the West Indian middle classes posed a serious obstacle to the creation of this sense of a collective purpose. Aspiring merely to protect their jobs and salaries, the white-collar strata had little notion of what kind of society they hoped to build, end quote. The dyed-in-the-wool revolutionary expressed a certain degree of frustration as he interrogated the class into which he was born. Quote, where does personality, literature, art, the drama stand today in relation to a national development? What is the relationship between claims of individuality and the claims of the state? What does education aim at? To make citizens capable of raising the productivity of labor, or to give them a conception of life? West Indian intellectuals are interested in or move around politics, avoid these questions as if they were the plague. End quote. James, The West Indian Middle Classes, page 135. End footnote. By social purpose, James clearly had in mind something grander than an aspiration for material wealth, or even national sovereignty. Prosperity and independence were of course necessary, but they were at the same time insufficient. What James was calling for was nothing less than the formation of a coherent national identity, what James referred to in a speech delivered at the University of the West Indies in Mona, Jamaica, as a, quote, long and deeply rooted national tradition, ... end quote. Footnote. James, The Artist in the Caribbean, reprinted in C.L.R. James' The Future and the Present Selected Writings, published in 1977. In this speech, James calls attention to the absence of a national tradition in the West Indies that is capable of generating or sustaining great artistic achievement. James goes on to argue that, quote, these conditions can be changed, ... The threads of a tradition can be discovered among us and made into a whole, ... But to do that, we must have the consciousness that the nation which we are hoping to build, as much as it needs the pooling of resources and industrialization, and a higher productivity of labor needs also the supreme artist, end quote. Pages 189 to 190, end footnote. Only through the development of a, quote, national consciousness, end quote, could the West Indian people transcend, quote, this matter of shallow roots, end quote, as James so delicately put it. Footnote, James, the Artist in the Caribbean, page 185. By, quote, shallow roots, James had in mind the absence of a national tradition in the West Indies. Quote, for us and for people like us, there is no continuous flow, such as, for instance, the Bachs in Haydn into Mozart into Beethoven. ... There is no dawn in our ancestry for us to rediscover and stimulate the invention of new forms and new symbols. End quote. James, the Artist in the Caribbean. End footnote. Quote, we can console ourselves, James added, by pointing out that, quote, science has nothing to do with it. Look at Ibsen and Kierkegaard and the Greek city-state, end quote. James, the Artist in the Caribbean, page 185. It was a matter of developing a national will, a sense of mutual purpose and endeavor. It is little wonder that the nation became so preoccupied with the negotiations over federation and the status of the Chaguaramas territory, and with the campaign for Frank Worrell. All of these issues had the potential of arousing in the West Indian population a national sensibility. Each invoked to one extent or another a process of demarcating the socio-cultural boundaries of the East Caribbean nation. There was one artist whom James felt had already made a special contribution to the creation of a specifically West Indian character. The calypso singer Francisco Slinger, quote, otherwise known as the Mighty Sparrow. Mighty Sparrow was born in 1935. His real name is Slinger Francisco. Is a Trinidadian calypso vocalist, songwriter, and guitarist. Known as the Calypso King of the World, he is one of the best known and most successful calypsonians. Mighty Sparrow has won Trinidad's Carnival Road March competition 8 times, Calypso King/Monarch 8 times, and has twice won the Calypso King of Kings title. Back to the text. Footnote. James, Party Politics in the West Indies, page 159. The section on the Mighty Sparrow is reprinted in James, The Future and the Present, page 191 to 201. James reports that he, quote, used to go and hear him record, ... end quote. End footnote. There is a venerable tradition of calypso singers/songwriters using their music to offer satirical commentaries on sports, politics, marriage, and other topical subjects. Calypso music, of course, is a central attraction of the annual Carnival, a 2-day festival of song, dance, and costume that is held on the Monday and Tuesday preceding Ash Wednesday. A great deal of planning and preparation goes into each carnival, which nevertheless retains the feel of a spontaneous event, with spectators, quote, jumping up to the music. Footnote. Writing in The Nation, James described Carnival as, quote, the extraordinary spectacle of entertainment, sport, free competition, and the practice of the arts to one degree or another, being carried on by a populace. In fact, all sections of the population, without any inculcation from above, without any educational instruction, without any encouragement or stimulus by philosophically minded person or persons who are interested in the arts as such, end quote. C.L.R. James in the article Carnival in Anna Grimshaw's The C.L.R. James Reader. End footnote. The mighty sparrow remains one of the best known and most highly regarded of these carnival performers. James was struck not only by the mighty sparrow's appreciation for the social dimension of political independence, but also with the unusually close bond that the singer-songwriter enjoyed with an embryonic national audience. Footnote: see Sparrow's song "Jean and Dina," which attacks the U.S. position on Chuguara Mas. Jesus Christ, I cannot pronounce this word. Chaguaramas. Boasts, quote, "It's the glamour boys again. We're going to rule Port of Spain. No more Yankees to spoil the fete," end quote. Why are the Yanks such spoilers? Sparrow described the barroom behavior of the American soldiers, quote, "But leave them alone, don't get in a rage. When a Yankee drunk, he don't study age. For whether she is 24, 25, or 80, I am sure it would not interest a drunken Yankee. For when you drink Barbaro nectar, it doesn't matter how old she is, as long as the Yankee get what is his," end quote. James adds, quote, "Sparrow is uninhibited about what he sees. He doesn't get in a rage, but he views the world with a large detachment. His irony and wit are the evidence," end quote. James, Party Politics in the West Indies. End footnote. James wrote, quote, "His talents were shaped by a West Indian medium. Through this medium, he expanded his capacities in the medium itself. He is financially maintained by the West Indian people who buy his records. The mass of people give him all the encouragement that an artist needs. Although the calypso is Trinidadian, Sparrow is hailed in all the islands and spontaneously acknowledged as a representative West Indian. Thus he is in every way a genuinely West Indian artist, the first and only one that I know. He is a living proof there is a West Indian nation," end quote. James, Party Politics in the West Indies, page 160. Given his political sympathies, it is perhaps not too surprising that a class-conscious figure like the mighty Sparrow comes off better than members of the elite. The book's preface offered a familiar statement of the author's, quote, "from the bottom up," end quote, message. Quote, "Any government that is not conscious of the power of the people is bound to be a bad government. That is to say, it will fool you, cheat you, and if need be, reduce you to hewers of wood and drawers of water, and without mercy keep you in what it considers to be your place. That is the last hill which the people of the West Indies will have to climb. It is hardest of all. When you climb it, you will arrive at a height from which you will never fall," end quote. James, Party Politics in the West Indies. Thus there were grounds for optimism, yet one can detect a certain amount of misgiving about the political culture of the West Indies. Quote, "I have never known," James wrote at one point, quote, "a population claiming to be democratic where so many people, both Negroes and Indians, live in such fear of the whole apparatus of government, ... end quote. James, Politics in the West Indies. At another juncture, James states, quote, "I have repudiated in unambiguous terms the false and dangerous conception that we have been so educated by the British that the instinct for democracy is established among us. I want no misunderstanding here. I see every sign that the tendency to naked power and brutality, the result of West Indian historical development, is here all around us. ... Has democracy sunk ineradicable roots in us? I say that I see no sign of it, and many signs to the contrary," end quote. James, Party Politics in the West Indies, page 111. Despite his anti-colonialism, James nevertheless saw the merit of many aspects of the, quote, Western tradition. James did not suppose that West Indian politicians and civil servants would be necessarily better than their British counterparts, nor did James counterpose the achievements and limitations of European civilization to the virtues of Minty Alley. If West Indians were to move beyond the colonial mentality, they would have to appropriate and transform rather than reject wholesale the political and cultural traditions they had inherited. It is difficult to see how James could have been more explicit on this point. Quote, "We have to master a medium, whatever it is, that is developed in a foreign territory, and on that basis seek and find out what is native, and build on that. It is obvious that our present race of politicians are too far gone ever to learn that. But there are signs that the truth is penetrating younger people. It is the West Indians' truth that matters above all. Perhaps Sparrow will make a calypso on it." End quote. James, Party Politics in the West Indies. A cruder form of nationalism, one that failed to excite the deepest aspirations of the people, would only exacerbate the tendency toward, quote, "naked power and brutality," end quote. That was colonialism's unfortunate legacy. From James's perspective, there was the danger that William's politics could move in this direction, crudely adopting the linguistic and rhetorical style of the working class, but refusing to lay the foundation for a higher purpose. Achieving the proper balance between forging a distinctive West Indian identity and learning from the West was a key problematic animating the 6 lectures on modern politics that James had under the auspices of the Trinidad Public Library's adult education program in 1960. James's central theme concerned the historical, intellectual, and cultural contributions of classical, Renaissance, and liberal thought to humanity and their contemporary relevance for a West Indian audience. Each lecture attracted an audience of several hundred, serving to underscore James's point that cultural and social progress would depend on the involvement of large numbers of people. The fact that James had only just relinquished his editorship of The Nation may have added to the sense of anticipation that the series generated. Some in the audience may have perceived that a break was imminent between the peripatetic dignitary and the PNM leadership over the nature and future of Trinidad's independence. As if to confirm this rupture in relations, Williams ordered that the printed compendium of the 1960 lectures be suppressed. Footnote, quote, "For many years the printed volumes lay in a warehouse in Port of Spain under guard. Ultimately, Williams relented to the extent of letting a New York book dealer buy the lot and take it out of the country," end quote. Martin Glaberman in the Introduction to C.L.R. James, Modern Politics, published in 1973. End footnote. The project's ambitious scope was clearly reflected in the range of material covered in the series. The first lecture introduced the concept of direct democracy as practiced in Athens and other Greek city-states, favorably contrasting it with liberal representative government. The second traces classical Marxism roots in French and German philosophy, emphasizing the democratic character of Marxist thought. The third and fourth lectures cover a wide array of topics related to contemporary history, such as the emergence of a world market, the threat of fascism, the, quote, "failure of the nation-state," and the promise of a better life, a better way of life as symbolized by the Hungarian Workers' Revolt of 1956. The final 2 lectures concern leading artistic figures of the 20th century and their complex relationship to, quote, crises in intimate relations, end quote, which originate in, quote, a dislocation of society, end quote, under modern capitalism. The thesis tying these variegated topics together was that only a sweeping reconstruction of public and industrial life could avert the disintegration of modern society. As in any standard survey of Western civilization, modern politics opens with the Greeks. In this particular investigation, the city-state's virtues, particularly the city-state's capacity to integrate individual wills, is a recurrent theme. One reason for this emphasis on classical civilization is that James believed that small nations with meager economic resources could achieve grand results in the spheres of politics and culture. A more fundamental justification, however, had to do with the intrinsic value of classical Greek culture and the, quote, remarkable character of Athenian civilization, the ancient city-states. Quote, "Formed, in my opinion, the most remarkable of all the various civilizations of which we have record in history, including our own, ... And it is not only that we today rest upon their achievements, it is far more wonderful than that. If today you want to study politics, it is not because Aristotle and Plato began the great discussion, not at all. In order to tackle politics today, fundamentally, you have to read them for the questions that they pose and the way that they pose them, they are not they are not superseded at all, end quote. James. Modern politics. Building on a long-standing interest in the foundations of political theory, James ascribed the exceptional character of social life in ancient Greece to two main factors: mass participation in the institutions of the city-state and the dense emotional and political bonds harmonizing the individual with the wider community. Since male citizens, but not of course slaves, females, or foreigners, had an authentic voice in the polity, they felt an intense attachment to the city-state. This attachment itself constituted, quote, the basis of a good life, end quote. James. Modern politics. In appreciating the need to reconcile communitarianism and free individual expression, Athens attained a more or less rational balance between the, quote, individual citizen and the city-state, ... end quote. Despite 2,000 years of scientific and technological progress, humanity never recaptured the organic equilibrium of the city-state. It is with a considerable sense of melancholy that James announced that, quote, people have lost the habit of looking at government and one another in that way, end quote. James. Modern Politics, page 4. In the domains of art, politics, and philosophy, the citizens of the ancient city-state created the foundations for a meaningful life for the enfranchised minority, but recapturing the spirit of the ancient city-state's communal solidarity, and extending its benefits to all members of society, involving something more complicated than simply harking back to the past. Above all, it required an international movement toward the realization of a democratic, non-capitalist order where the alienation of modern individuals from the public sphere and from the tyranny of political economy could be meaningfully addressed. This in turn necessitated an engagement with the question of capitalism versus socialism. Here James called attention to the contribution of Marxism, believing that this tradition represented the most fully developed analysis of capitalism and the struggle for capitalism's transcendence. Drawing on classical Marxist precepts, the lecture stressed the capacity of ordinary workers to effectively intervene in revolutionary situations and otherwise defend their autonomous interests. The Marxist conception of the social power of workers is memorably expressed in the following passage, quote, when 10,000 school teachers, bookkeepers, the writers and talkers like myself and editors and so forth vote, that is 10,000 votes, and they can have 1,000 extra and even 11,000 votes and defeat 10,000 workers in votes. But the moment of a revolutionary struggle is on, the workers, this group takes the railways, the other one the waterfront, the other one turns off the electricity, and the other one stops the transport. The teachers, etc., can only make some noise, but they cannot do anything. They can send the children back home or bring them back or something. In all struggles of this kind, it is the proletariat that is master of the situation, end quote. James, Modern Politics, page 61. This mastery of the revolutionary conjuncture reflects the structural power of the working class as constituted in the sphere of production. The working class was not only a powerful social group, however, the working class was for James a vital component in the creation of a new order based on an enlightened form of workplace and community-based councils. History's forward march clearly points toward the possibility and desirability of reorganizing society along democratic and participatory lines. Quote, there has been a development. The development is along the lines that I have tried to show. Man is ready for great strides forward today, end quote. Footnote. Recapitulating one of the themes of American civilization, James argues that, that the potential for, quote, great strides coexists with the threat of social collapse and nuclear war. James calls this his, quote, main theme. Quote, the consciousness of total breakdown, return to barbarism, the possibility of suicidal self-destruction, ... end quote. This breakdown is rooted finally in capitalism's rapacious, destructive nature. Quote, it is capital that rules, and it is capital that dictates the manners and morals of those who submit themselves to it, end quote. James saw in Trinidad's movement towards independence the opportunity for challenging the logic of capital through popular mobilization and education, for creating a new type of society that nevertheless shared certain features in common with the ancient city-state. That a connection is drawn between the new West Indian society and the ancient city-state is surely not accidental. In his biography, Paul Bull writes that in modern politics, quote, world history assumes a spiral upward which recapitulates the original in many ways, albeit at ever higher stages, end quote. Bull, C.L.R. James, The Artist is Revolutionary. Patrick Gomez argues that James's philosophy of history had distinctively evolutionary and optimistic overtones. Quote, rather than Marx, the influence of English historian Arnold and Toynbee is clearly evident, and an accumulative tradition enriches the development of human civilization, end quote. Yeah.
Got cheese and pepperoni and crackers and stuff out.
Hell yeah. At the same time, the fear that the future could prove profoundly retrogressive is barely concealed. Quote, the world will choose between hydrogen bombs and guided missiles in some form of workers' councils. In 1960, the Marxist doctrine, either socialism or barbarism, seems to me truer than ever before, end quote. James, in Books to Read, Modern Politics, page 167. In modern politics, the movement for Caribbean self-determination has the potential for playing a critical role in the development of a new order. By setting out along the path of self-organization laid out by the city-state, West Indians could break with the colonial past and instigate regional rebellion. But the revolutionary capacity of the West industrial proletariat to avert the collapse of world civilization is emphasized as well. Quote, the passing of colonialism, end quote, James wrote, quote, is a sign of the weakness of the capitalist bourgeois state, and at the same time it provides ammunition for the breakdown of these imperialist states which dominated them before. Nevertheless, there is no question about it. The basic opposition to imperialism must come from the proletariat of the advanced countries, end quote. Footnote. James, Modern Politics, page 90, end footnote. As sympathetic as James was to the cause of national liberation, James clearly remained committed to Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. Thus, as paradoxical as it might have seemed to some members of the audience, Trinidad's most famous Marxist and Pan-Africanist maintained an abiding commitment to the prospect of First World working-class insurrection coming to the aid of Third World nationalist forces. As we have seen, this was a commitment he combined with a profound respect for classical and Western intellectual traditions. Lecturing on modern politics in the port of Spain was perhaps James's finest hour during this strange and compressed episode. The contribution that he had to make was in the realm of theory, not practice. In retrospect, it is clear that his ability to alter the course of events had from the outset been limited by a number of external factors. These included William's considerable organizational talents and political instincts, the region's reasonably solid economic prospects, and perhaps, as some authors have suggested, the backstage role of the United States authorities. His impact was also perhaps limited by his decision not to build on an independent political vehicle, and by the fact that James's island roots had withered over time. In addition, a brutal 1962 road incident in Jamaica had an adverse effect on James's already delicate health. Footnote, quote, he has remained rail-thin ever since. A tendency towards palsy now also became almost overwhelming, making the very act of eating, or as a lecturer holding his notes, difficult. See Paul Bull's C.L.R. James, The Artist is Revolutionary, 1988. Anna Grimshaw, who spoke to James at length about this period of his life, emphasized the role in which financial worries and the lack of a close network of comrades slowly drained his energies. See Anna Grimshaw, Jim Murray, and Kent Worcester, C.L.R. James in the 1980s, A Conversation with Anna Grimshaw. Not seeing any thing for that book. End footnote. James had to apologize to a group of West Indian students in Edinburgh, Scotland, for sitting down to lecture there in 1964. Footnote. No such apology was given by James when he lectured in May 1964 to the West Indian Students' Union in London on the topic of tradition and the West Indian novel. The text of this lecture was published by the Students' Union as a pamphlet, subsidized by his old friend Leary Constantine, and reprinted in Wilson Harris, Tradition, the Writer, and Society. Published 1967. Not seeing any good descriptions of this book. End footnote. James told the students, the West Indian students in Edinburgh, quote, much to the disappointment of some of my friends, my mental facilities were not affected by the accident. They began assiduously to spread the news around that James's brain was not what it was. I am not able to stand as much as I used to, but my brain, for what it is worth, is what it always was, end quote. James, in A National Purpose for Caribbean Peoples, reprinted in James at the Rendezvous of History, end footnote. James then added, quote, I am much better educated in the ways of West Indians after spending 5 years among them, end quote. It was a melancholy remark. His time in Trinidad did not go nearly as well as he had originally hoped. New section. This Trinidadian episode had a bittersweet coda. James returned to Trinidad in March 1965 to cover the English and West Indies Test match cricket for the London Times and the Sunday Observer. Within 24 hours of his arrival, James was placed under house arrest. Footnote. The terms of the house arrest restricted him to Barataria, where his sister Olive lived, and to her house between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. End footnote. Coincidentally, the government's powers of detainment had been strengthened under the 1965 state of emergency, declared, quote, during an outbreak of periodic unrest in the Sugar Belt, end quote. Footnote. Oxel, Black Intellectuals Come to Power, page 182. Back to the text. Despite protests from the Trinidad Guardian and other respected sources, the house arrest lasted 6 weeks, coming to an end only once the labor dispute had been resolved. For Williams, James's return raised the specter of, quote, subversion and helped spark calls for a commission of inquiry into subversive activities. The name of Williams's old tutor featured prominently in the resultant report. Footnote. A section of the report which specifically concerned James and his friend Walter Anamuntodo intoned that, quote, from evidence before us, it appears that Mr. James is a native of Trinidad and an author of some report well known in England and America, end quote. The report concluded that although James was a confirmed Marxist and an enemy of constitutional government, there was no evidence that James had ever engaged in dangerous or counter-state forms of activity. That's from Report of the Commission of Inquiry into Subversive Activities in Trinidad and Tobago, Port of Spain, Government of Trinidad and Tobago, 1965. Back to the text. Sorry, I don't know why I said back to the text. End footnote. An editorial in The Nation published in July 15th, 1966, warned that a, quote, specter is haunting the trade union movement, ... The specter is the political ideology of Marxism dressed up in the white robes of purity, end quote. Quoted in Kafra Kambon for Bread, Justice, and Freedom, published in 1988. End footnote. Can't find anything for that book. Wait, did I read the right footnote? I don't know. Where the hell am I? Seeking to mobilize public opinion against an increasingly autocratic PNM, James returned to Trinidad in the summer of 1965 to join forces with two well-known figures, George Weeks, president of the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, which had been founded in 1939, and former Democratic Labor Party politician Stephen Maharaj. I'm not seeing anything for George Weeks. That's simple. And Stephen Maharaj. Not seeing anything for him either. Anyway, seeking to mobilize public opinion against an increasingly autocratic PNM, James returned to Trinidad in the summer of 1965, to join forces with two well-known figures, George Weeks, president of the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, which had been founded in 1939, and former Democratic Labor Party politician Stephen Maharaj. Maharaj has previously served as deputy to oil worker leader Uriah Butler, who had been a prominent member of the DLP's pro-labor wing before being edged out of the party. Tubal Uriah Butler lived from 1897 to 1977 and was a Grenadian-born spiritual Baptist preacher and labor leader in Trinidad and Tobago. Uriah Butler is best known for leading a series of labor riots between the 19th of June and 6th of July 1937, and for forming a series of personalist political parties, the British Empire Citizens and Workers Home Rule Party, the Butler Home Rule Party, and finally the Butler Party, that focused its platform on the improvement of the working class. Back to the text. Although Weeks was widely seen as a capable and popular trade union leader, some criticized Weeks for attempting to import Marxist ideas into the labor movement. Footnote. Okay, that was the footnote from earlier that I was supposed to read. An editorial in The Nation published on the 15th of July, 1966, warned that a, quote, specter is haunting the trade union movement, ... The specter is the political ideology of Marxism dressed up in the white robes of purity, end quote. Quoted in Kafra Kambon for Bread, Justice, and Freedom, published in 1988. Back to the text and footnote. In collaboration with a number of associates, Maharaj Weeks and James proudly launched the Workers and Farmers Party on August 8, 1965. Wikipedia says the Workers and Farmers Party was a Marxist political party in Trinidad and Tobago. The Workers and Farmers Party was organized by former Democratic Labor Party leader Stephen Maharaj, C.L.R. James, George Weeks of the Oil Fields Workers Trade Union, included the then little-known Basdeo Panday among its slate of candidates. The Workers' and Farmers' Party was succeeded by the United Labor Front, led by Basdeo Panday. The Workers' and Farmers' Party contested the 1966 general elections. It secured 3.5% of the vote and failed to win any seats in Parliament. None of its candidates secured the 12.5% of the vote in their constituency that was required to have their deposits refunded. The major political impact of the Workers' and Farmers' Party was that it launched the political career of Basdeo Panday. Back to the text. They used their new four-page newspaper, We the People, which James edited, to criticize the government and build support for their populist venture. As the editor wrote in one article, quote, "There is nothing that you wish to teach them which they, bracket, the people, and bracket, cannot learn. We therefore propose to teach them how actually to practice democracy," end quote. James, cited in Consuelo Lopez's article, or unpublished dissertation of 1983, titled C.L.R. James, The Rhetoric of a Defiant Warrior. End footnote. Where am I? Their high-profile organization vowed to run a full slate of candidates against the PNM in the 1966 election and to provide a radical and yet responsible alternative to the policies of, quote, instability and repression, end quote, that was said to characterize Trinidad and Tobago under Dr. Williams. Footnote. See Anna Grimshaw, The C.L.R. James Archive, a Reader's Guide, published in 1991, page 24. The party's program called for a, quote, repudiation of the historic tensions between Afro-Caribbeans, Indo-Caribbeans, and other Trinidadians, for a defense of such, quote, basic democratic rights, end quote, as freedom of speech and assembly, for, quote, vigilance against governmental corruption, and for the, quote, development of a nationally based economy, end quote, through encouraging smallholder agriculture, greater public supervision of the nation's financial and economic resources, and a dynamic industrial base. Footnote. See Grimshaw, The C.L.R. James Archive, page 23 to 25. The party made a special effort to reach out to rural farmers and workers. In one Workers' and Farmers' Party pamphlet, J.M. Doob called for the, quote, breakup of the large landholdings, end quote, to distribute farmland to rural people. Quote, there is ample sound scientific evidence for the measure, if only one is prepared to read what has been discovered on peasant experimental farms, end quote. He concluded somewhat cryptically. See J.M. Doob's Settling the Farmers, Workers' and Farmers' Party, 1965. End footnote. The overall thrust of the program was nationalist, neo-Keynesian, and social democratic. Williams and his supporters responded to his unanticipated challenge on its left flank by claiming that the Workers' and Farmers' Party was led by pederasts and Castroites. Footnote, cited in Oxel, Black Intellectuals Come to Power. End footnote. Footnote, Williams urged an audience of PNM supporters in San Fernando to, quote, go out and finish up with the Marxist ideology which goes to Havana, Cuba. ... Castro has no business setting up any revolutionary organization in order to interfere with and disrupt the normal development of Trinidad and Tobago. End quote. See Eric Williams, Inward Hunger. End footnote. During the election, the government had James's movements closely monitored by security forces. Despite its democratic and progressive program for change, the party failed to mobilize the kind of popular support the party needed to mount a serious electoral challenge to William's rule. The party's rallies never rivaled those of the PNM. Walton Look Lie asserts that the Workers' and Farmers' Party, quote, never managed to develop truly organic links with either ethnic section of the Trinidad working class, end quote. Footnote: Walton Look Lie's article, C.L.R. James and Trinidad Nationalism, published in Henry and Bull's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Caribbean. End footnote. Walton Look Lie goes on to argue that, quote, James's own image was somewhat damaged by this hurried venture into left politics, ... end quote. Sharp questions were raised about the basis on which the leadership of the party had come together, and even sympathetic critics saw the leadership of the Workers' and Farmers' Party as, quote, an unlikely triumvirate, end quote. Ivar Oxall, Race and Revolutionary Consciousness, published in 1971. The full title of that book is Race and Revolutionary Consciousness, a documentary interpretation of the 1970 Black Power Revolt in Trinidad. Back to the text, end footnote. In a 1987 interview, the West Indian George Lambing said that it was a, quote, mistake for James to enter into a, quote, battle of rivalry with Williams, end quote. This brief flirtation with an electoral strategy was, quote, fundamentally in contradiction to James's position that what was more important was the building of movements, not getting parties ready for election, ... end quote. George Lambing went on to say that, quote, when the gladiatorial show was over, the next move was departure, end quote. George Lambing and Paul Bull, C.L.R. James, West Indian, in Henry and Bull's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Caribbean. While the Workers' and Farmers' Party ran a spirited campaign, the final result was more than a little disappointing. In fact, the party did very badly in the election, quote, failing not only to win a single seat with just about 3% of the popular vote, but actually losing all their candidates' deposits in the process. This included James himself, who managed to win just 2.8% of the votes cast in his home constituency of Tunapuna, ... end quote. Footnote. Look Lie, C.L.R. James and Trinidadian Nationalism, page 200. End footnote. The PNM, on the other hand, secured 68 of the 100 available seats, with the bulk of the rest going to the Democratic Labour Party. James packed his bags for London a few weeks after the results were announced. James always maintained, however, that the Workers' and Farmers' Party had run a principled campaign and had raised many important issues. As James later recalled, quote, the program we had was a more powerful program than any of the revolutionaries have had up to now. They are ready to overthrow, but the problem is that they can't say what they want instead, end quote. James. Ian Murrow and Reinhard Sander, Cos, Interviews of Three Caribbean Writers, published at the University of Texas, 1972. Not seeing any descriptions of this. It just says, Cos, Interviews with Three Caribbean Writers in Texas, George Lambing, C.L.R. James, and Wilson Harris. Back to the text and footnote. And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.